Have you ever wondered whether a single decision made in the middle of the night, when everything is still uncertain, lights flicker softly, and a few people sit quietly around a table, could alter the course of history for hundreds of years? If, on that night, just one line had been written differently, just one stroke of the pen changed, would the map of the world today look the same as it does now? And would I, still be living in the same world we know today? November 1917. Europe is sinking deep into the First World War, a conflict in which humanity is witnessing, for the first time, the full and terrifying power of modern warfare. Trenches stretch for hundreds of kilometers from France into Belgium, where soldiers on both sides live surrounded by mud, corpses, and a constant, grinding fear. More than 10 million people have already lost their lives. Empires once thought unbreakable, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, are exhausted, drained both economically and psychologically. The old world order, which had stood for centuries, is now on the brink of collapse. In this context, Britain, the empire famously described as the one on which the sun never sets, remains the world's dominant naval power, yet even it is being worn down by the relentless demands of war. Britain needs a decisive advantage, something that could help end the conflict before its economy and society begin to unravel. Its greatest rival, the German Empire, still holds firm on multiple fronts and is actively seeking new allies, particularly in the Middle East. In that region, the land of Palestine is still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic empire that has existed for more than 600 years and now stands as Germany's ally in the war. Palestine is not rich in natural resources, nor is it densely populated, but its strategic value is immense. It lies close to the Suez Canal, the vital artery connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, and the lifeline of Britain's global trade and military power. Losing control of this region would mean risking the strangulation of Britain's entire colonial system. At the same time, across Europe, and especially in the United States, Jewish communities are gaining increasing influence in finance, media, and politics. Many British leaders believe that this influence could prove decisive in shaping public opinion and government policy in America, a nation that has not yet fully committed itself to the war. If the United States were to enter the conflict more forcefully, the balance of power could shift decisively in favor of the Allied forces. Gradually, the British government begins to see the question of Palestine not only as a military concern, but as a diplomatic instrument. Some politicians believe that supporting the Zionist movement, already taking shape since the late 19th century, could help Britain secure international backing while also providing a moral justification for long-term control of the region after the war. At the centre of this story stands Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary at the time. A seasoned statesman, a former Prime Minister known for his calm demeanour, his reserve, and his extreme caution with words. Balfour understands that in wartime, diplomacy is not merely about promises, it is a weapon. Every sentence he signs has the power to open doors or to ignite consequences that can never be undone. That night, in London, inside a quiet, enclosed room, there is no sound of artillery, no battlefield maps covered in red markings. There are only stacks of documents, exchanged letters, and long discussions held in near silence. Yet within that stillness, a decision of historic consequence is slowly taking shape. A decision that seems, at first, to serve only the immediate needs of war, but one that will later become the starting point for upheaval, conflict, and tragedy stretching across more than 100 years of human history. Few people realize that the Balfour Declaration, A document later seen as the foundation of a conflict lasting more than a century was, in reality, nothing more than a short letter, fewer than 70 words long. Yet behind that brevity lay months of argument, revision, and deep internal conflict within the British government. In particular, on the night before the document was officially signed, every sentence was weighed again and again, not out of humanitarian concern, but because of intensely practical political calculations. At first, some members of the British cabinet argued for stronger language, wording that would almost certainly guarantee the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. They believed that a clear and decisive promise would generate powerful support from Zionist movements around the world. Others, however, immediately pushed back. The reason was simple, yet deeply sensitive. Palestine was not an empty land. At the time, more than 90% of its population consisted of Palestinian Arabs, communities that had lived there for generations, with villages, land ownership, religious life, and cultural traditions rooted in the soil for centuries. If Britain openly endorsed the creation of a Jewish state, it would risk provoking widespread Arab uprisings, potentially destroying its entire post-war strategy in the Middle East. And so, the final solution chosen was not clarity, but deliberate ambiguity. The phrase, a national home for the Jewish people, was inserted as a perfect compromise. It did not explicitly promise a state. It defined no borders. It said nothing about the political rights of the local population. A carefully balanced line, vague enough to avoid immediate confrontation, yet strong enough for each side to interpret in its own favour. What is even less widely known is that, at the very same time, Britain was making promises that directly contradicted this declaration. In earlier correspondence and agreements, British officials had assured Arab leaders that they would support the independence of Arab peoples if they rose up against the Ottoman Empire. In other words, over the same land, Britain offered two different futures to two different peoples. There was no plan for reconciliation, no mechanism for resolving conflict. Only a single, overriding objective: victory in the First World War. When the Balfour Declaration was made public, the world's initial reaction was relatively muted. There were no immediate global protests, no dramatic headlines, no mass demonstrations, but the document was like a stone dropped into still water. At first, the ripples were small, barely noticeable. Over time, however, they spread outward, growing wider, colliding with one another. For Jewish communities, the declaration became a moral and legal foundation for the movement of return, reinforcing the belief that a global power stood behind their aspirations. For Palestinian Arabs, it was clear evidence of betrayal and external imposition, a future decided without their consent, without their voice. After the First World War, Britain formally assumed control of Palestine under a mandate. Jewish immigration increased steadily. Tensions between the two communities escalated, from isolated clashes to organized violence and eventually to full-scale war. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared, and from that moment on, the Middle East entered a cycle of conflict that, even today, has never truly ended. And it all began with a document completed in a single night. No referendum, no consultation with the people who lived on the land. Just a few carefully chosen lines written to serve the immediate needs of war, yet leaving behind a historical cost that would echo across generations. The most unexpected part is not the decision itself, but how its consequences were understood, or rather, misunderstood. The people who signed that document never imagined that they were creating one of the longest lasting flashpoints of modern history. To them, it was simply a strategic move in the First World War, a way to use diplomacy as leverage. to gain an advantage in a desperate moment. But history does not move according to short-term intentions. A decision made in the quiet of a single night, meant to serve only a few years of war, went on to shape the lives of millions for centuries to come. It reminds us that the greatest power does not always lie in weapons or armies, but sometimes in words, in agreements that seem invisible at the moment they are made. This story forces us to reconsider the responsibility carried by those who make decisions. When choices are made in the dark, their consequences often unfold in the light, where future generations are left to bear the cost. And perhaps the deepest lesson of all is this: history is not shaped only by battles and bloodshed, but also by silent nights, when a pen is set down and the world turns permanently in another direction.